Do you believe in predestination or free will? I'm willing to bet you've been asked that before, but this question is misleading and starts the entire discussion off on the wrong foot. You see, almost no one who believes in predestination actually denies free will, but because the two so often get set in opposition, people think you can't believe in both. At this point, feelings can get pretty heated, and often people say some harsh things about each other. People who believe in predestination are frequently told they believe in a God who's kind of like a cosmic rapist because he forces people to love him. Of course, elephant in the room, the biggest association in most people's minds when predestination comes up is Calvinism. Calvinism is a tradition of Christian theology which emphasizes predestination. Calvinism is named after French lawyer and 16th century Reformation theologian Jean Calvin, better known in English as John Calvin. Now, every Christian group and church has some kind of doctrine of predestination because the word appears a lot in the Bible. Acts 4:28, Romans 8:29, Romans 8:30, Ephesians 1:5, Ephesians 1:11. But the Calvinist version of predestination is really controversial. Do a quick search on YouTube or Google and you'll find videos, blogs, and websites devoted to debunking Calvinism. Here are a few of my favorites. 5 points of Calvinism refuted. Defeating Calvinism. The dark side of Calvinism. Arguments against Calvinism and predestination. 5 dangers of Calvinism. Tulip exposed. What's wrong with Calvinism? Exposing Calvinism. All of Calvinism refuted by one verse. Ex-Calvinists get saved after 26 years under the lie of Calvinism. The trouble with Calvinism. Calvinism and predestination proved wrong, refuted, and destroyed. Calvinism and grace are not compatible. Calvinism creeping in. Smoke a Calvinist. The trouble with Calvinism. Calvinism is satanic. And my favorite, Calvinism, schmalvinism. If you've ever heard a conversation or argument about Calvinism, it was probably really tense, and someone was probably saying things like, Calvinism makes us into puppets, or Calvinism makes us into robots, or Calvinism makes God the author of sin. Here's what Dr. Norm Geisler, a Christian apologist and outspoken critic of Calvinism, had to say. Calvinism has God dragging people kicking and screaming into his kingdom against their will. Irresistible grace on the unwilling is a violation of free choice. For true love is persuasive, but never coercive. There can be no shotgun weddings in heaven. Irresistible force used by God on his free creatures would be a violation of both the charity of God and the dignity of humans. God is love. True love never forces itself on anyone. Forced love is, you guessed it, rape. And God is not a divine rapist. Gee, Dr. Geisler, why don't you tell us how you really feel? That's some serious stuff. But is it true? Do Calvinists really believe in this kind of God? Well, first off, Calvinists don't deny free will. The Westminster Confession of Faith, probably the most important Calvinist statement of belief in history, says this: God has endued the will of man with that natural liberty that is neither forced nor by any absolute necessity of nature determined good or evil. So, hurrah, free will. We get to do what we want to do. The problem is with the want to. That's why the confession goes on to say, man, by his fall into a state of sin, has wholly lost all ability to will to any spiritual good accompanying salvation, so as a natural man, being altogether averse from that good and dead in sin, is not able by his own strength to convert himself or to prepare himself thereunto. Translation: free will is really important to people who believe in predestination. It's not the opposite of predestination, but according to the main Calvinist confession and the Bible, something is wrong with us. Our wills are free in the sense that we can do what we please, but what we please is always to sin. That's a problem. Now, you may have heard of something called the 5 points of Calvinism, which are really just 5 doctrines about salvation derived partially from Calvin's work, combined with the canons of Dort, Assembly in Holland, and more recently with the acronym TULIP. That is, total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. These are also called the doctrines of grace. For now, forget these, because what we call Calvinism is actually much simpler. Here it is in a nutshell. God makes the ultimate decision on who gets saved and who doesn't. He doesn't choose us because we chose him, or because he knew we were going to choose him, or because he likes our personalities, or because he sees great potential for a return on his investment, or because we believed in Jesus, not even because we gave in to incessant harassment and forwarded that chain email about the footprints in the sand. As the Apostle Paul puts it in Titus 3, he saved us, not because of righteous things we had done, but because of his mercy. That's tough, because people don't want to be told God is in control over salvation, or that he gets to save whoever he wants. They think it means God can't be loving, or that we're not really free to make our own choices. And so they start saying things like, Calvinism makes us puppets and robots that God controls, or it makes God into a divine rapist. When someone like Geisler starts comparing God's predestining act to rape, it should bother you. People who say this are taking the biblical analogy of Christ as a groom and the church as his bride and twisting it into something ugly. In Calvinism, God doesn't woo or court his church, they say. He forces himself upon her, like a rapist, or the IRS. Same thing. But there's a big assumption here. If you're comparing predestination with rape, you think it's possible that God could have wooed us, that all he had to do was ask us to be his, and we would say yes. In this book, The Joy of Calvinism, Greg Forster offers an amazing counter-analogy to the rape argument. Once upon a time, a young man met a young woman, and the two of them fell in love. After a giddy and exciting courtship, brimming with anticipation, the young man resolved to ask the young woman to marry him. He spoke to her father, acquired the ring, planned out the most romantic possible setting for the proposal, and invited her to meet him there. Now, the young woman studied chemistry. Being intelligent and spirited, she was of a curious nature. On the morning of the day on which the young man was planning to propose marriage, she was visiting a pharmaceutical plant to learn about its processes. Succumbing to temptation, she tampered with the machines in her desire to learn more about them, and she was exposed to a toxic chemical. She was immediately thrown into a state of deranged madness. She hated everyone in the world, most especially the young man who loved her. Later that day, when the young man asked her, "Will you marry me?" she denounced him in a rage of cursing and swearing such as no one in that town had ever heard. She was brought in for treatment, but the doctors couldn't help her. They pronounced her condition irreversible and untreatable. Her madness grew worse until she would physically attack anyone who even approached her. Before long, she was confined to an asylum, kept in restraints at all times. There she lay for years and years, strapped to her gurney, endlessly raging and cursing against the world. Now the young man was like the young woman, intelligent and spirited. He dropped out of law school to study medicine, becoming a doctor, working night and day for years. At long last, he discovered a way to cure her condition. From the instant he entered her cell, she screamed imprecations at him more horrible than any she had uttered in all her long years of madness. When they removed her arm restraint to administer the injection, she seized the front of his throat and plunged her fingernails in as deeply as she could. The orderlies pulled her arm away, but his 5 wounds were deep, and they never fully healed. As he administered the injection, she began screaming, "No!" over and over. She continued screaming it after he left until she had screamed it 666 times. But the treatment worked, and when she woke up the next day, she came to herself. When he walked into her cell to see how it was with her, she cried out, "Yes!" They wept. As they embraced, she began saying, "Yes!" over and over, until she had said it 70 times 7. He nursed her back to health, and their amazing story spread to international fame. They were at long last married. When the minister had pronounced them man and wife, the husband leaned in to kiss her, and she whispered, "Thank you that your love was stronger than my hate." So, is this kind of predestination divine rape? Nope. The story of Calvinism is the story of salvation. It's the story of a God who loves us so much, he wouldn't let our hate get in his way. So the next time someone calls Calvinist-style predestination divine rape, expose them to some toxic chemicals. I mean...